All right, session B2, payment and census policies. What we'll be covering in this next hour includes policies such as satisfactory academic progress and summer Cal Grant. We'll talk more about disbursements and census policies, including important timeframes and the Cal Grant withdrawal policy. And we'll round things out with non-term and clock hour schools. They have slightly different rules, so we want to make sure that financial administrators from those schools are supported and know how to report their Cal Grant payments. So first, let's look at some general payment policies. The first being satisfactory academic progress, or SAP. So students must maintain SAP in order to keep receiving Cal Grant. SAP standards are established by the School of Attendance and should be in compliance with the federal minimum standards and those set by Assembly Bill 789, which I will talk about on the next slide. There are three components to SAP, first being the qualitative component, which is GPA, the second being the quantitative component, or pace of progression. That is the number of units the student has attempted and the number of students that they have completed or passed. So that percentage of how many units they earned. And finally, the third component is maximum time frame, which federal standards dictate that the student may have up to 150% of their published program length. To give you an example, a maximum time frame on a 60-unit associate's degree would be 90 units. So that maximum time frame would be 90 units. Anything above 90, they would have to submit a SAP appeal, or they would no longer qualify for aid at that particular school in that particular program. Assembly Bill 789 became effective in the 24-25 academic year, and this requires all Cal Grant participating institutions to set their SAP standards based on federal minimum standards and those set by this particular bill. Essentially, what this bill did is that it prohibited Cal Grant participating schools from having SAP policies that are more strict than federal standards. And this is specifically for the Cal Grant program. Now, some schools have separate SAP policies for their federal aid, like Pell or direct loans, and a separate SAP policy for Cal Grant. However, most schools tend to have one blanket SAP policy that includes all of those programs. And so if you are a Cal Grant participating school, which I imagine you are if you are here today, then you'll want to make sure that your SAP policy is no more strict than the federal standards. So I talked about that GPA component. The federal minimum is a 2.0 GPA. Quantitative component, that minimum pace of progression is 67% at the federal level. I talked about maximum time frame. Also, this bill specifies that schools must have an incremental measurement, or how often they check SAP. Some schools check SAP after each term and may have a SAP warning status. Other schools will run SAP once per year. Either is fine, as long as you are consistent among all students and that you are running SAP based on the student's cumulative GPA and PACE, not their per term GPA and PACE. It has to be cumulative across all of their terms. The appeal process must be easily accessible for students and easy to understand. Your school must have procedures for re-establishing SAP eligibility in the case that maybe a student doesn't appeal or their appeal is denied. And finally, you must make sure that you are checking SAP before dispersing funds. This is crucial, and this is actually an audit finding that we'll talk about in tomorrow's session. If you are still refining your SAP policy, make sure it's in alignment with AB 789. John Burton Advocates for Youth has a really helpful toolkit, and we've linked that at the bottom of the page here. So I recommend using that link and following what guidelines that JBA has provided. So we have a test your knowledge question. We've got a few, in fact, for this next hour, so I hope you're enjoying those. So I'm going to open up this next question here. All right, a student was reported as NP, not meeting SAP, in the fall term by another school. The student then transfers to your school for spring and is added to your roster following a school change. Is this student eligible for a spring payment? True or false? So go ahead and enter your answer there on the poll, and we'll talk about the answer in just a moment. Okay, I'm going to give it a few more moments. All right, very good. The majority of you said true, which is the correct answer, but there is a caveat. So for those of you who said false, you may have been thinking about this. So if a student is reported as not meeting SAP in the fall by another school, it doesn't mean that they cannot receive a payment for spring at your school, because their SAP will be based on your school's policy, and an NP in the fall does not prevent a payment from being posted in the winter or spring. Now, that caveat I mentioned is that anytime the NP code is reported for 3 consecutive terms, then the Cal Grant will be withdrawn. So in this case, as you can see, the last time they were reported as NP was in 2020, and then they were reported as NP in fall of 2025. So for spring of 26, it would not have been a consecutive NP. There would have been a few years in between there, and so the student could technically be eligible for a payment. So very good. Great job. Now let's talk about repeat coursework. Cal Grant follows the federal rules for repeat coursework, which makes it easy because I'm sure most of your schools are having to implement this policy for Pell Grant or for other Title IV aid. And so institutions should also refer to their own internal policies, but across the board, Cal Grant is going to follow those federal rules. So for repeat coursework, students can receive Cal Grant funds if they are repeating a course for the first time, when they are repeating a course that was previously failed or from which the student withdrew or was withdrawn, or when a student is repeating a previously passed course one additional time. I have some scenarios on the next slide, which we'll go over in just a moment. But if you want more information about repeat coursework policies, you can refer to our 2526 Cal Grant Handbook on page 17, and in the FSA Handbook, specifically in Volume 1, Chapter 1. So let's look at some examples, and if you'd like to follow along in the chat box, feel free. So in my first example, I have a Cal Grant student who is currently in their second attempt of a class. In the first attempt, maybe last semester, they passed that class. Now that they're taking the class for the second time and it's currently in progress, are they eligible for Cal Grant payment? So if you think you know the answer, put it in chat. In this scenario, yes, the student would be eligible for the course because they're repeating it for one additional time. Even though they've passed it already, they are good. Now, any further attempts after this, it possibly could not be eligible depending on if they fail or if they pass. But in this case, they are good to go. In the next example, we have a student in their third attempt of the same class. In their first attempt, they passed the class. And in the second attempt, they withdrew partway through the term. Now, during this third attempt, they are, yes, indeed eligible for Cal Grant because they have not passed it a second time. In the third example, the student is also in their third attempt of the same class. They passed the first attempt and failed the second attempt. In this case, they are actually not eligible for Cal Grant. And the reason being is because they completed the class, but they failed it. So this is a third attempt with 2 fully completed terms prior to that. So in this case, no Cal Grant is available for that particular class. Now, they may have other classes that they're taking that aren't repeat coursework. So it's not that they wouldn't be eligible for Cal Grant for the entire term. They just wouldn't be able to get it for that particular class. So when you're determining their enrollment status, you would want to omit this particular course from that enrollment status determination. Now, in example 4, they are also in a third attempt where they've passed it twice. And again, this is a no situation because they have 2 completed terms, in this case with 2 passing grades. So the third attempt is not eligible for Cal Grant. And finally, this student attempted the first term in which they either failed or withdrew, and now they're in their second attempt. In this situation, there is kind of a it depends answer. Yes, the student could receive Cal Grant funds for repeating this course that they had previously failed or withdrew from, regardless of the number of attempts. So if this is occurring, they can continue receiving Cal Grant. However, SAP policy is still going to apply. So they won't be able to do that for too much longer because eventually it's likely that SAP will catch up to them. Again, if you want more information about repeat coursework policies, I recommend the FSA Handbook, Volume 1, Chapter 1, and then we also have a section about it in our handbook. Now let's talk about another policy. This is a consortium agreement, and these are allowed for Cal Grants. It is a contractual agreement between 2 affiliated schools. This is going to be between 2 colleges that recognizes the student as registered at more than 1 school for financial aid purposes. So this is very common in instances where students attend multiple community colleges part-time, or perhaps they're at a university, but they're taking community college courses to satisfy a lower division requirement, right? Here in Sacramento, we have the Los Rios Community College District, which is comprised of 4 separate campuses. So students oftentimes are enrolled at multiple campuses to take certain classes. What happens is one campus has to be designated as the payer in the consortium agreement, which means that campus can combine all eligible units from all the different schools and pay the student based on those units, but only one school can pay. That's it. That we do not allow multiple schools to pay the same student in the same term. Consortium agreements are often common with study abroad programs, which we'll look at in just a moment here on the next slide. But quick trivia question, the student here is holding a flag of a country. If you know the name of that country, type it into the chat box. I'm also a flag nerd, so in addition to video games, I do like flags. So let me know if you recognize that country's flag. All right, moving on to studying abroad, which Tina recognized it as Germany. Great job, Tina. So let's say we had a student studying abroad in Germany. Students can actually receive Cal Grant funds if they are taking classes abroad, as long as the following 2 requirements are met. So first, the home campus should be the Cal Grant participating institution. That school should administer all of the students' financial aid. They should disperse Cal Grant funds based on their existing FSA guidelines for education abroad or for travel study programs. So, there has to be other requirements in place. So make sure you're following your school's policy on travel abroad programs. Also, the campuses must have a formal consortium agreement in place or an equivalent before dispersing those Cal Grant funds. And then also, the courses that the student takes while studying abroad must count toward their degree completion in order to receive Cal Grant funds. So keep these in mind for your study abroad students. Now let's talk about summer Cal Grant. So for those of you who may not know, summer is considered a trailer term for the academic year in terms of the Cal Grant program. That means for Cal Grant, the summer term is the very last term paid in the academic year. So it would be fall, winter, spring, summer. Even if a school considers their summer term as a header, meaning the school considers their academic year to go summer, fall, winter, spring, the Cal Grant is always going to be paid in the year that it falls as the trailer. To give you an example, summer of 2026 is considered the trailer term for the 25-26 Cal Grant year. So if you're paying a student for summer of 26, it's going to be under the 25-26 roster. Now keep in mind that summer payments do reduce the student's remaining eligibility. So keep this in mind, especially if your students do not have mandatory summer enrollment. If they're taking discretionary courses and they want Cal Grant, it is helpful to counsel the student to let them know, hey, if you use the Cal Grant, you may have fewer terms going forward if you're still planning on graduating in 2 years or 4 years or whatnot. Now, new Cal Grant awardees are eligible for a summer payment in their first year. Some are going to require special handling, which we will talk about in a few slides. Now, there are 2 summer enrollment options for Cal Grant, and the first being for mandatory summer enrollment. These are year-round schools, typically those that are structured in a way where the summer term is required as part of the degree program. Schools will let us know if their summer term is mandatory by indicating this on their college cost estimate form. Each school is required to submit this form every year, and they use the form to let us know, if summer is mandatory. They let us know their term start and end dates, their preference between Cal Grants A and B. And we'll talk a little more about college cost estimate forms in tomorrow's session. Now, when a school tells us that they have mandatory summer terms, CSAC will program that into web grants that will allow the school to see the summer term immediately on the display roster. They don't have to request it separately. On the other hand, traditional schools usually have discretionary summer enrollment, meaning it's up to the student if they want to take summer classes because it's not required. In this case, the student will have to request Cal Grant, usually through their financial aid office in whatever manner your school does. And the financial aid office will have to go into the display roster for that particular student and manually add the summer term. The summer term option usually opens sometime in May. So if you go in there today, it's likely not going to have that option to add the summer term. What we do is CSAC will send out a GSA or a GOM through our listserv to let you know when summer terms have opened up for discretionary schools. So keep this in mind that you will have to add students' summer terms individually if you are a traditional school with discretionary summer enrollment. Now let's talk about special handling rules for those enrolled in a mandatory summer term. For students receiving Cal Grant B tuition and fees, you may remember from yesterday that first-year freshman students are only given access unless they are in the top 2%. Students in their sophomore, junior, and senior years can qualify for both tuition and fees and access as long as it's at a school that is not a community college. Now, when you have a student who was in their first year freshman year, but by the summer is considered a second year sophomore, they could receive tuition and access awards for the summer term. But since summer is a trailer, that's going to require a manual payment request. So you'll want to reach out to CSAC school support in order to pay the student as a sophomore for summer. That's because Web Grants is going to still recognize the student as a first year freshman for that year, so it's only going to have the option to pay access. So just let us know if the student qualifies. And then for Cal Grant C books and supplies for our community colleges and our trade schools, just note that students can receive a summer payment preceding their first year as a Cal Grant awardee. This is also a manual payment process because Web Grants is treated as a trailer. So if your school has a that begins July 1st or later, and you want to pay a student that is now Cal Grant eligible, just contact CSAC school support and we can assist you with that. Now we're going to move into disbursement and census policies. I will just quickly outline the general disbursement rules, but these are listed in your institutional participation agreement with CSAC, or the IPA. It's specifically under Article 4. So if you're a Cal Grant participating school, you have to make sure that you're confirming that the student meets all Cal Grant eligibility and program requirements prior to disbursement. You want to make sure that you establish and maintain your own written Cal Grant disbursement policy. This is crucial because it's going to come up in an audit, and it also avoids overawards and overpayments. This policy has to be consistent across all of your students. Now, schools should also be dispersing Cal Grant funds within 15 business days of when you've determined the student's enrollment status. But now that we don't do advances as we once did, this time frame applies once Cal Grant funds are available in your account. So when you're reporting payments and you're, receiving those funds from CSAC, make sure that you're dispersing those to students within 15 business days. And then make sure that all of your disbursements and adjustments are completed no later than the final reconciliation deadline in August. This year it'll be around mid-August, so keep an eye out because we will be sending out a listserv notification of that exact date. Now let's talk about census policies, which if you're not familiar with census, this will help kind of make sense of it all. Now, CSAC for Cal Grant, our policy is to align with the federal guidelines for census outlined in the FSA handbook and in Ed Code. So it's very consistent there. Unless it's otherwise stated in your own institution's refund policy, the census date is also known as the freeze date or maybe the add drop date. This is the date where the student's Cal Grant enrollment status is locked. So whatever enrollment status they were in on that census date, that is what they were eligible for in Cal Grant funds. Institutions must also have published a calendar that identifies their own census dates, and they must be able to produce that calendar upon request. So this should really be on your website because students need to be aware of what your institution's census dates are for each term, because that's most likely going to apply to all of their other aid as well, right? Any Title IV aid is usually going to abide by a census date. And in the case of schools that have terms and modules, you may even have a secondary census date as well. And we do have more information about census as well as secondary census dates in our handbook. And we also released a GOM here that goes into more detail. So I do recommend bookmarking that particular announcement. Now, can Cal Grant be dispersed retroactively? In most cases, yes. If you are dispersing to a student after the end of the term, this is fine as long as the student has met all of the Cal Grant requirements and that their payment is based on their enrollment status at the end of the term. So even if they were enrolled, say, half-time at census, but they were enrolled full-time at the beginning of the term, you're going to pay them based on their half-time census status. Okay, they're not going to be eligible for full-time since they were full-time at the beginning of the term. They would be eligible for half-time. Now, sometimes the student ends the term with failing grades or perhaps unearned grades like withdrawals. So if you are a term school, all completed coursework counts toward that Cal Grant enrollment status if you are dispersing at the end of the term. We get this question a lot because it does feel kind of unusual to pay a student for an F grade. But if you consider it this way, an F grade means that the student was in that course from start to finish. They finished the course. They may have failed, the grade wise, but they were in that course. So you can pay Cal Grant even if the student earned an F grade or an incomplete grade that hasn't yet converted to an F because the student failed to complete the coursework. Schools should also follow their own disbursement policies, but whenever you're in doubt, Cal Grant policy says that you can pay on an F grade. A withdrawal grade, maybe like a W or a U, that, based on your school's policy, may not qualify because they weren't in the term all the way till the end. So I recommend reading our handbook because we talk more about failing grades in there. Now, this is what CSAC suggests for your census guidelines. Schools should be following their own census policies, but generally speaking, this is what most schools do. So if the initial Cal Grant payment is made before census, then their final Cal Grant amount is going to be based on their enrollment at the time of disbursement. But you may have to adjust if their enrollment status changes at census. You may be at a school that pays, prior to the first day of school or on the first day of school. And the students, as we know, are adding classes, dropping classes. Their units are going up and down. And so, depending on your system, that may be automated, but the student's final Cal Grant amount will be based on what they were enrolled at census. If you're making the initial payment at census or after census, you're basing the enrollment on what they were in at census. And as we talked about, if you're making a disbursement after the completed term for the very first time, their enrollment status is based on what they were in at the end of the term. So including those failed grades. We have more guidance on this on pages 43 through 44 of that Cal Grant handbook. And now I have a few more test your knowledge questions for you. I'll get these pulled up here. So at census, a student was enrolled full-time and a full-time payment was reported in web grants. After census, the student's enrollment dropped to 3/4 time. Is a payment adjustment required? And if so, which code should you use? Should you adjust it to full-time, adjust it to 3/4 time, or is no adjustment needed? All right, just a few more seconds here. All right, very good. Looks like the majority of you selected no adjustment needed, which is correct. No adjustment is required because the initial payment was made at census while they were still enrolled full-time. The student dropped to 3/4 time after census, which was after that snapshot date or that freeze date. So they are okay to keep the full-time payment. Very good. Now we have another census question for you. Let me pull that up. A student was enrolled full-time at the start of the term, and a full-time payment was reported. The student subsequently dropped to 3/4 time at census. Is a payment adjustment required? And I should point out that we are using the CSAC suggested census guidelines here. That's why I have this chart posted here. Your school may have a different policy, but based on this suggested policy, what would be the answer? All right, looks like most of you are answering here. Very good. Give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to end that poll. Excellent. The vast majority of you, almost 90%, said true. Yes, a payment adjustment is required because the student dropped to three-quarter time at census. So their enrollment was snapshotted or frozen at census at three-quarter time. So in this case, the student may owe the difference if they've already been paid full time because now at census they're three-quarter time. Excuse me. Very good. And one more census question. A student was enrolled full-time for the fall and did not appear on your roster until the spring term. Can the student be retroactively paid for fall? Yes or no? So I'll give you a few moments to answer that. Excellent. Looks like the majority of you have answered, and a resounding 96% of you said yes. That is the correct answer. Students can be retroactively paid for the fall term as long as they met all eligibility requirements. Cal Grants are annual awards, so students can be paid for all terms for which they are eligible. But remember that when you're paying the initial payment after the end of the term, payment's going to be based on the number of units completed. So keep an eye out for those withdrawal grades, if they didn't complete the term in a certain class. But F grades are considered earned grades, which means they can be paid on an F grade. Excellent. Great job, everybody. Now let's talk about withdrawal policy. So in the case that a student completely withdraws from the term, you may be familiar with the federal term Return to Title IV, or R2T4. Cal Grant also should have a withdrawal policy that's similar to R2T4. I don't really call it R2T4 because it's technically not federal aid, but it's that same idea. And when your school builds their withdrawal policy, they need to have the following requirements. Other than these requirements, it's up to the school to determine what they do with Cal Grant when a student withdraws. So your policy must include all Cal Grant program types, including tuition and fees, access, and books and supplies. They have to be all, included in that policy. Your policy should also consider and comply with R2T4 requirements as they're specified in the FSA handbook. So make sure you are referring to that handbook when developing your Cal Grant withdrawal policy, or if you're refining it if you're an existing school. Your policy must specify how your office determines the earned portions of Cal Grant and the unearned portions of Cal Grant. If you're new to R2T4, it's essentially when a student withdraws from the term completely. It's calculating how much of that financial aid that they've received, how much of it they can keep, and how much they have to return to the school or to the program. Your policy also should apply to students who withdraw within 60% of the payment period. This is in alignment with federal policy. So if they're withdrawing before that 60% mark, they will have to have their Cal Grant calculated to determine which is earned and which is unearned. Now, your policy should also consider students who withdraw after the 60% point to have earned all of the money they were dispersed. This is also in alignment with federal R2T4. You may know if you work R2T4s at your school that once a student withdraws after the 60% mark, they're they're good to go. They can keep that aid that they were paid because they have considered to have earned 100%. So to give you an easy example, if you have a 100-day term, if the student withdraws after the 61st day, then they could keep all of the funds, unless your school's policy defines otherwise. And then finally, your withdrawal policy should use appropriate adjustment reason codes like, ooh, that should be full time, not FF. Full time, three-quarter time, half time in web grants to adjust the award amount in the case that a student has earned some of it and has to return the rest of it. Now, when you're adjusting a refund for a withdrawn student, the award also has to be adjusted in web grants. If you're determining that they can keep a portion and they have to return the rest, you have to make sure that you're reconciling that in web grants. The student's enrollment status should be adjusted so that it uses the least amount of lifetime eligibility. In this case, we don't want to penalize a student for withdrawing and receiving only a portion of Cal Grant funds. We don't want to use the maximum eligibility for the term because they're not keeping that full amount. I'll talk more about it on the next slide, but to give you an example, if a student was paid full-time Cal Grant, but you've determined that they can keep or that they earned a portion that falls under the halftime equivalent, in that case, I would use the halftime code because they would use less lifetime eligibility for the amount that they can actually keep. This is in the student's best interest. And then also please note that when you're adjusting dollar amounts for tuition and fee awards, make sure that this award does not exceed the total amount of tuition that was charged to the student upon withdrawal. Some schools will adjust tuition based on the time the student was enrolled, right? They're prorating it. And so if you're adjusting tuition and fees, just make sure that that amount does not exceed whatever their tuition charges were. On this next slide, I actually have a test your knowledge question, which will help it'll help you visualize this. So let me pull up this poll here. Okay, so we have a student who was paid $3,225 in Cal Grant A tuition and fees for being enrolled full-time in the spring. The student withdrew before the 60% point. That means that the withdrawal policy applies. In this case, the school prorated their tuition to $1,500 based on when the student withdrew. When you go to adjust the payment, because in this case, at this school, they determined that the student can keep $1,500 of the Cal Grant and they have to return the rest because they only were charged $1,500 for tuition. In this case, which adjustment reason code can the school use to report the earned portion of tuition and fees? This is a tricky one, so I'll give you a few more moments. Good, I see lots of people answering. Like I said, don't worry, this is a tough one, so we'll walk through it together. So we're adjusting the award to $1,500. So we just want to determine which code should we use. All right, I'm going to end that poll. And it looks like the majority of you are correct. Great job. So in this case, you can actually use a halftime code because the student only earned $1,500 in Cal Grant based on this school's policy. A halftime award for this school is $1,613. And that only uses 25% lifetime eligibility. So if I'm going to override this award amount to $1,500, I might as well use the halftime code. If I were to keep it as full-time, the student can still only keep $1,500, but they're using 50% lifetime eligibility. In this case, we're working in the student's best interest. They're only keeping $1,500, but we're using a halftime code so that they're only using 25%. So this is just this is something that schools can do. It's not a requirement, but CSAC does recommend this because, again, it's in the student's best interest. Great job, everyone. All right. Now let's wrap up this session with non-term and clock hour schools. So in a non-term academic calendar, classes don't begin and end within the set time frame. So unlike traditional academic terms like semesters or quarters or trimesters, non-term schools may be offering flexible start dates or self-paced learning. Academic progress in the non-term program is measured usually in either credit hours or clock hours. And many of our Cal Grant participating institutions are actually structured under a non-term calendar, and they do have special requirements. So the thing about Cal Grant is this program operates under a traditional term-based academic year, which is from July 1st to June 30th. So that means that non-term schools must establish a Cal Grant payment period with predetermined start and end dates. So these schools will establish those start and end dates using the college cost estimate form. So if they're a brand new school, new to Cal Grant, they'll establish those by submitting a paper form to us. And then every year that they, continue to participate in the Cal Grant program, they will set those term dates using the online form. So as a result, Cal Grant payments at non-term schools are spread out over the academic year. And when a non-term class overlaps between two preset Cal Grant payment periods, there are two requirements. So first, the student must be enrolled at least one half of the predetermined Cal Grant payment period in order to receive Cal Grant funds. So we'll look at some example term structures on the next slide. But essentially, if their class is overlapping between two of the Cal Grant terms that the school decided upon, the student not only has to have been enrolled for at least one half of that period, but also that class can only be applied to one of the two terms. So again, overlapping classes, you're going to apply that class to the student's enrollment status for only one of the payment periods, and it has to be the payment period for which they were enrolled for at least one half of the time. Let's look on the next slide and it'll make a little more sense. So these are recommended term structures from CSAC for non-term schools. If a non-term school wants to pay 3 times per year, they can be set up on a trimester schedule with a fall start date of July 1st, a spring start date of November 1st, and a summer start date of March 1st. So these terms are about 120 days each. So as I mentioned, if a class overlaps between these terms, the student had to have been enrolled for at least, in this case, 60 days in order to receive payment for that class. Now, for schools that want to pay 4 times per year, they can do a traditional 4-quarter structure with 4 start and end dates, and these payment periods would be about 90 days each. One other thing to note is that we recommend considering what academic terms are listed on your institution's e-CAR when you're choosing a term structure. And if you're a brand new school, we're going to advise you that way because your e-CAR may say that you have a quarter program or a semester program, trimester, whatever. So again, non-term schools, even though they don't have set terms, they do have to establish Cal Grant terms because Cal Grant operates on a traditional term structure. Now let's take a look at clock hour programs, which, non-term schools are typically in clock hours. We follow federal guidelines for clock hour programs, so make sure you're referring to the FSA Handbook, Volume 3, Chapter 1. For a clock hour program, one academic year is the equivalent of 900 clock hours and 26 weeks of instructional time. Real quick, I will say that when you are determining Cal Grant C eligibility or Cal Grant B eligibility or A. Remember that these requirements, these cycles, they require that the student has a program of a certain amount of time, a certain length of time. To give you an example, Cal Grant C programs have to be at least 4 months long. And in that case, that would be one half, so that would be 450 clock hours. Cal Grant B programs have to be at least 1 year long, so at least 900 clock hours total. Cal Grant A, at least 2 years long. So keep that in mind when you are paying students on your roster. Pay attention to what program they're actually in and make sure that that program is the correct length of time for Cal Grant A, B, or C. Now, in a semester or a trimester hour, at least 30 hours of in-class instruction are required. And then for quarter hours, at least 20 in-class hours of instruction are required. So here are some suggested guidelines for converting clock hours to credit hours for the purposes of Cal Grant determination. Cal Grant is based on enrollment status, full-time, three-quarter time, and half-time. If you are a semester clock hour school, you would divide the annual clock hours by 2 semesters. 900 divided by 2 is 450 hours per term if a student is considered full-time. Three-quarter time would be the hours listed here, and half-time as well. And these would convert to credit hours, which would allow you to determine how much Cal Grant the student could receive for that term. Quarter schools, you're going to be dividing 900 by 3 quarters. So again, a full-time student would be taking the equivalent of 300 or more hours, and so on. So these are our suggested guidelines. Schools should follow their own policies, but this is what we recommend. And here is our second to last test your knowledge question. A student completed 340 clock hours in the fall semester and 460 clock hours in the spring semester. How much Cal Grant eligibility did the student use for the academic year? So this will require a little bit of math. So 340 clock hours in the fall, 460 in the spring. Remember how much eligibility is used for each term of Cal Grant and the way that clock hours are converted to credit hours. So I'll give you just all right, looking good. Got lots of answers coming in. I'm going to end the poll. The correct answer is 87.5%. So great job to 57% of you. This is a tricky one, though, especially if you're not a semester school. These percentages are going to be different. If you're a quarter school, you may be used to those figures as well. And so based on federal guidelines for semester clock hours, this student would be considered three-quarter time for fall and full-time for spring. Make sure you're referring to your own school's policy. Now, our final test your knowledge question before we end the session today. So let me see. All righty. Last question. CSAC Career College offers a 630-hour program that begins August 29th and ends January 30th. For students enrolled in this program, for which terms could they potentially receive a Cal Grant payment? Here is the school's college cost estimate. They determined their start date for fall was September 3rd, and their start date for spring was January 7th. So they're attending from August 29th to January 30th. For which terms could they potentially receive a payment? Perfect. I see lots of you voting. I'm going to end the poll. Awesome. 74% of you answered C, fall and spring. Now, payment amounts are going to depend on the number of hours completed, but yes, based on these time frames, their fall payment period began on September 3rd and ended on January 6th, and their spring payment period began January 7th. Since the student is enrolled through January 30th, they could possibly get a spring payment, but it all depends on how many hours were completed. So make sure that you are referring to your own school's policy as well as that clock to credit conversion rate. Excellent. All right, and wrapping things up, just to remind you, we will be emailing you out some surveys. You'll want to take the survey for each session you've attended, A, B, and C. You do not have to attend each session consecutively, meaning if you can't join us for session C tomorrow, you can always join us again in June. Once you've submitted that survey that we send you by email, and you've let us know that you've completed all 3 sessions, we can send you a certificate of completion. So just let us know once you've completed all 3 surveys, send us an email and we will send you a certificate. And with that, I want to end things with our contact information. If you have any questions about today's training or about any upcoming trainings, you can reach out to the training team here. Your school support line, you can call or email the school support team for assistance. And if your students or families need help, we also have the student support email as well as the phone. And with that, that ends today's session B. Thank you, Mina, for being such a great presenter for part 1, and we hope to see you all tomorrow for session C, which will be presented by Yvonne and Victoria. So we hope to see you then. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.